relates to the tactical, the operational, and the strategic levels of war. Tactical, how do we, in a sense, close the killing ground, take out the other team on their hill opposite, move through the wood, maintain our formation? How do we locate ourselves on a particular immediate landscape? For most of history, that has been absolutely crucial, but it has not involved physical mapping in the sense of producing a map which you are then going to retain for a long time. Instead, the mapping has largely been mental mapping, people saying, actually literally being on or in advance of the battlefield and saying, we'll move to the left of that hill, or we'll move through the woodland over there. And that kind of mental mapping, and which may well have been supplemented by, let's say, drawing with a stick in what you would call the dirt, or I would call the earth, that kind of mapping was absolutely crucial for most of history. Indeed, when we think of maps and war, and as you may know, I did a book called Maps and War, we're really looking at relatively recent occasions, because it's only relatively recently that most of the landscape has been mapped in sufficient detail to determine how you would locate forces tactically. So that's the tactical level. Operationally, let's say on an operational level, how do we, if we are on one side of the Chesapeake and have 6, 7, 8,000 men in 1814 during the Chesapeake Bay campaign, how do we determine how best to move towards Baltimore? Now, in that kind of question, maps became more valuable earlier because, in effect, you were spatially trying to understand a sort of wider landscape which you physically could not see more than a small portion of. So maps were much more important in that sense from earlier on. And then there is the strategic question. Now, strategy can be conceived of in a number of ways. I've written a couple of books on strategy. There is no fixed view of what strategy means. But if you think of strategy in terms of what the Americans used to call grand strategy, then strategy itself very much does require mapping, because that is something that is handled almost as an abstraction at a distance. If you are Union commanders in 1861, 1862, meeting with the president in Washington, conceiving about how best to defeat the Confederacy, then you're going to need a map somewhere. You might have that map in your head, but you're certainly going to need a map to also indicate the ideas from your head in terms of something that other people are going to readily be able to follow.
Wonderful. Now, you've kind of touched on this, but could you elaborate on just how much use of maps did commanders of land campaigns, generals, make before the 20th century?
Well, that's again an excellent question. I mean, I think the key thing is, as the key thing is always with war, is fitness for purpose. So generally, people produce maps in a form and in response to needing them for a specific goal. And that's what I call fitness for purpose. Now, if you're, for example, thinking of the American War of Independence, American Revolution, whatever you want to call it, then clearly the situation depended in part upon where you were thinking of campaigning. If you're thinking of campaigning very close to the coast, close to the environs of, say, Boston in the winter of 1775, 1776, then you have very little need for a map. If you're General Howe or General Washington, you can actually see what is going on. But if, on the other hand, you're conceiving how best to invade Canada, if you're an American policymaker or general in 1775, if you're Montgomery, say, or Arnold, or conversely, if you're planning moving south, as Burgoyne did in 1777, then you will need a map to try and understand the relationship between the landscape of the specifics and the broader campaigning area. And that broader campaigning area can only be understood from a map.
As you know, many members of our audience have a particular interest in the American War of Independence. And one of them, in fact, contacted us ahead of this presentation um, and asked that we ask you, how did, during that conflict, did British and commanders and their rebel enemies acquire the maps that they used?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, both sides, and indeed the French as well, had the enormous advantage that they were fighting over a terrain that had already been fought over. So in other words, what you would call the French and Indian War, we would call it the 7 Years' War, had already ensured that there was quite good mapping for military purposes of the eastern portion of North America. So, for example, the Lake Champlain corridor, which is to be very important in 1775, 76, and 77, had been extensively mapped in 1758, 1759, and 1760. So that's point number one. There were good maps surviving from the 1750s. They had been printed extensively in the 1750s. And then after the war, the mapping had continued, particularly, in fact, on the coastline. The British Admiralty had ensured that there was really very good maps produced on the coastline of America, and those maps were widely available. The French fleet that came to America in 1778 and the French forces that came with them had British maps. There's a good book on that by the American scholar Mary Pedley. So the mapping is not too much of a problem. What is a problem is some of the things that, as it were, should go with mapping. So let me give you an example. You can understand very well the distance involved if you are moving from Montreal to Albany in 1777. What you cannot understand from the map is the difficulty of the terrain. And I would say that one might have good maps, but poor situational awareness. To use a World War II example of this process, the Germans had maps, they weren't particularly good ones actually, but they had maps of the Soviet Union in 1941, which had been enhanced by aerial reconnaissance, etc., etc., etc. What they had very poor understanding of was the key element of the situational awareness you would need to follow for geography. So in particular, the effect of summer dust, of autumn mud, and of winter snow on both the roads, but more particularly on the engines of their mechanized vehicles. They had very little understanding that when you produced a map which showed the available railways, it needed also to carry with it information about the disruption of moving from one railway gauge to another railway gauge. So maps can be very valuable if they're understood as part of a more general geographical, to use a modern term, GIS, geographical information system. But that geographical information system, much of it is to do with qualitative indications that aren't necessarily explained in a readily situational fashion.
Following up on that question, did either side in this conflict operate at an advantage over the other in respect to maps?
Yes, the British operated at an enormous advantage because they were the principal maritime power. The waters off North America had been very well sounded. There were very reliable maps on that, including, incidentally, you're speaking from Philadelphia, Greg, including, for example, on the river going up to Philadelphia, there were really excellent maps showing the British the depths of the water, for example. And that meant that they had a power projection capability. Now, once the troops had landed, it doesn't necessarily mean you succeed, viz., let's say, New Orleans in 1815 for the next war, but it does mean that you have a capacity to move at sea. And of course, in that period of time, the ability of the Americans or anybody else to move rapidly, a large force by land, was relatively limited because roads were poor and there wasn't really much of a system of bridging. So yes, that gives you a great advantage. America is also, and this a map doesn't really tell you in that period, if you were to say roughly, I mean, it's a pre-census age, but roughly 75% of the Americans in 1775 live within 75 miles of the coast, and roughly everybody that counts lives there, then clearly you are in a very different geographical context to the situation even by 1812, 1813, 14, 15, or when Britain was envisaging the possibility of war with the Union in 1861 or 62 or 63. So the mapping, I mean, in one of my books, I've reproduced a map of Virginia, which the British produced in the early 1770s. And that map is very good in the area around the Chesapeake. And then it gets pretty bad by the time you're going out towards the Appalachians. But bluntly, it doesn't really matter because you're not really interested in what's going on near the Appalachians. So their maps were pretty good for the war they thought they were going to have to fight, which was a war to gain control of the major cities and the major cultivated areas near them. And from that point of view, they were very well provided with information.
Roger just texted me to ask, can you think of any specific campaigns in the American Revolutionary War where maps were crucial?
Well, I think they're crucial in the sense in all campaigns, people need to see where they are, but the crucial, let me give you an example. The British knowledge of the Carolina backcountry is relatively limited, okay? Cornwallis, when he moves into the backcountry of South Carolina, then into North Carolina, then into Virginia, is obviously going through backcountry routes. But it's not the case that he needs to have a particularly sophisticated map in order to know where he's going towards the Chesapeake, because he relies overwhelmingly on scouts. He relies overwhelmingly on both his own troops and loyalists, and he's following established roads, or routes, I should say, better than roads, so that in a sense, he's not planning to go truly cross-country. And I would say that the British, on the whole, did not plan to go cross-country, nor on the whole did the Americans, for fairly obvious reasons. A key element is artillery pieces, and even more in terms of weight, the round shot that goes with them. You simply cannot take those across uncharted terrain, whether you've got a map or not, to show you where the hills or the rivers are. What you want to do is to follow a established route. And from that perspective, the range of the number of choices in North America is relatively modest. Now, if you want to give a contrast, when Napoleon invades Belgium in 1815, he again needs to follow a road, what's known as a chaussee, because again, he wishes to bring with artillery, in fact, very much wishes to bring with artillery. Napoleon has quite heavy guns and he wants to bring with the round shot with them. But there are a number, within a range of 60 miles west-east, there are a number of routes that he can choose to follow. And there are more than one bridging point over the River Meuse. Having said that, the very fact that in order to cross the Meuse and to advance along a chaussee on Brussels means that there's only a relatively small number of routes. And again, he's not going to go cross country. In a way, the defensive task is eased. Now, the key situational awareness, the key geographical or cartographic fact, if you like, is the river. And then beyond the river, the fact that there are a small number of chaussee. Where they precisely are is less important, in the sense that you're either, I mean, if you're in the French case, Napoleon crosses the river at Charleroi, you get to Charleroi, there is the bridge. From Charleroi, there is only one road north to Brussels. That's where you're going to go. And of course, there are, in fact, what we would call encounter battles, Quatre Bras, and just as there are encounter battles in the American War of Independence, Camden is classically an encounter battle. You don't really need to plan awfully much where you're going to fight. You are going to bash into each other if you're both operating on the same road. And many of the other battles, whilst not encounter battles in the sense that both of the armies aren't actually in movement, nevertheless, they relate to one road and the blockage points across it, usually behind a river. So Brandywine is a good example of that. It's not as though there is going to be an enormous number of choices of places to fight short of Philadelphia, because if you want to move along the route and you want to cross the river, you're going to fight at Brandywine if the Americans choose the Patriots choose to block you there. So I think that in a sense, mapping becomes more important when you have weapons systems that are independent of determinate physical factors on the ground. So what the hell do I mean by that? Well, let's say something like the Iraq War in 1991 or the Iraq War in 2003. In 1991, when you're maneuvering in desert, you have a greater range of choice as to where you're going. And of course, if you're maneuvering in airspace, and aerial combat begins, I mean, the first use of air power, of course, is in Libya with the Italians bombing before First World War, but the actual air combat between aircraft begins in World War I, then that opens up a completely different sphere of the mapping of war.
Yes, it's very interesting. You touched a few minutes ago on maritime affairs, which opens a window for me to ask this question. Within the last year or two, you reviewed a prize-winning book. It was published by one of my PhD students, Jason Smith, To Master the Boundless Sea, the U.S. Navy, the marine environment, and the cartography of empire. And he deals with hydrography, its uses in the U.S. Navy through the 19th century, which was attuned mainly to facilitating American commerce. But then after America starts moving down the path of imperialism and starts building a world-class Navy, it's more attuned to strategy. He talks an awful lot about how the U.S. Navy became absorbed in wargaming. With charts, with maritime maps. So I just wonder, in your own work, if you found the same trend occurring in other navies of the world in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yes, if I can plug one of my books, one of the other ones which isn't on the list, I think, is Mapping Naval Warfare. The American Navy, I mean, Charles Willis is a key figure here in the American Navy projecting itself into the Western Pacific from the 1830s onwards. That activity was crucially dependent on mapping. There's a very big difference between being an inshore Navy, where fundamentally you just need sounding information on how best to get into a harbour, because in the 18th and 19th century, the overwhelming number of ships that sunk at the entrances to harbours. That's classically where you ran aground. Once the Americans started long distance power projection, and they need a different form of mapping, and linked to that, Greg, exactly as you say, they need to consider and envisage what happens if they encounter others who will not be deterred, intimidated, or who deliberately seek conflict. And in a way, naval warfare requires you to think through outcomes to a greater extent. I mean, if you think about it, by the 1850s, you've got American squadron in the sea off Japan. 1860s, beginning of the late 1850s, you've got warships in the River Plate, in the Piranha. Obviously, you've had ships in the Mediterranean from the beginning of the 19th century, not continually. And then you start to move to a situation in which you are aggressively pursuing conflict against Spain in 1898, against Germany from 1917, but envisaging the possibility of it with Japan from before World War I. Now, all of those require the ability to determine how best to dispose of a finite number of units across a great area when they cannot be readily reinforced, or there may not be units available to reinforce them because they're otherwise engaged. And that kind of spatial awareness is best understood through a combination of cartography and wargaming. And the Americans become absolutely excellent at wargaming. There's been a couple of books on American naval wargaming in the interwar period, when obviously the so-called problems and the principal problems were how best to engage with the increasing likelihood of conflict with Japan, and as you know, the question about how far west you base your shipping, etc., etc. That requires what I call a dynamic cartographic environment, because in that dynamic cartographic environment, you have to build in things like the steaming time of ships, your own and others. You have to build in the flying range of others. You have to build in the possibility of ground support by aircraft and what happens if that ground support is taken out, etc., etc. And there are other factors as well, but it's what I would call a dynamic cartographic environment. Now, the problem is then complicated further by the fact that the Japanese are doing exactly the same. So your attempt to, as it were, to understand and prevail in a dynamic cartographic environment is complicated by the very fact that others are trying to get within your loop of decision making, and in a very tight time span, because air power means that there is the possibility of devastating your opponent and sinking a large number of their units very rapidly. Now, given that situation, it is not surprising that navies, which had always been interested in locating their shipping in particular on maps, because after all, you want to know where you are and you want to know your ability to return. And that's important once you navigate beyond the sight of land. So once you do that, when you're navigating within the sight of land, it isn't important. But once you navigate beyond the sight of land, navies have this added problem in the from the mid 20th century onwards. And I would say the American sophistication in mapping is very important. Now, as you probably know, the Americans and the British in World War II have developed separately but linked. They have mapping agreements between the two powers, which, for example, means that they determine which areas of the world they are each primarily responsible for mapping, and agree to exchange information. The British and the Americans, first of all, have a degree of activity in mapping, the actual physical production of the number of maps, the production of large quantity of that number of maps, and a crucial element, which is the regular updating of those maps, both in terms of more information about your own side and in terms of information about your opponents. They far outperform their opponents. On top of that, both Roosevelt and Churchill are war leaders who are very interested in maps. They each have a lot of cartographic assistance. They each, incidentally, like being portrayed with maps, and they are each engaged with an understanding of the way in which the world is changing as the result of long-range air power. So the idea of using different projections and perspectives is important. Now, that's important both politically. Roosevelt wants to explain to the American public that they ought to be concerned by what's going on in East Asia, or they ought to be concerned by what's going on in Europe. But it is also important militarily, because both in terms of the protection of America, which in a sense is the strategic first goal in 1940-41 into the beginning of 42, and then the idea of projecting American power so as to defeat opponents on their home bases. Both of those require understandings of the interaction of new technological systems and weapons systems. I mean, particularly long-range aircraft in the case of the Americans, and a very sophisticated and large and growing aircraft carrier force. But also you have to understand the limitations of these, and that does require bringing to your mapping the kind of dynamic information that I've already referred to. And in my, I think, there's this book, History of the World, Second World War in 100 Maps. And what I've tried to do is to divide it into strategic, tactical, operational, geopolitical, propaganda. But in particular, if you're looking at dynamic information systems, you're looking at things like, for example, this. The Americans and the British, but the Americans used a lot of geological information in order to map where you would best be able to locate airfields if you were advancing both into Europe and advancing into the Pacific. So in other words, that's an example. The integration of different data systems onto a common map base is an example of a more and more sophisticated fashion. The Americans, I illustrate one in there, became very good at mapping the location of water in the sense of where you could obtain reasonable drinking water. So, for example, there's some very good maps they did of Sicily and Italy for when they invaded there in 1943. There are very good what are known as goings maps. That's a British term, which are essentially maps of terrain, which establish its ability to carry vehicles, and in all sorts of respects, including the nature of bridges, etc., etc., etc. Now, all of this had to be integrated and understood. And of course, the British and the Americans have the advantage that they are not ideologically driven by a totalitarian military system, as the Germans were, the Soviets were, or the Japanese were, where crucially it's important to input information that sustains the mythos of the people running the system. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that Hitler in particular was geographically very poor, but he also was guilty repeatedly of a degree of spatial ignorance. So let me give you a classic example. Operation Blau in 1942, the German move east, we called it the Stalingrad campaign, but a crucial element of it was the attempt to conquer some or all of the Soviet oil fields to the north of the Caucasus in Chechnya, and then over towards Baku, but particularly the ones around Maykop. Now, the problem with that, which Hitler just wasn't interested in at all, was yes, you could get to them, particularly if you didn't get yourself too drawn into an incubus in Stalingrad. But Hitler really wasn't interested in the practicalities of how you move the oil from there. And that's an example of a dynamic information system. It's no good just chucking down as a symbol on a map, here be oil wells or here be oil fields. You also need to explain, if you want to use this oil, how you are going to move it, and in what kind of space-time constraints you're going to be operating. And the Germans were not good at that. I mean, I've written a number of books on World War II. Rethinking World War II is probably the best, but I've got another one coming out this year on the strategy of World War II. And one of the things I'm always trying to hit against is this notion that German the German war machine was particularly effective. It wasn't. They were tactically not bad. Operationally, they could be okay. It varied on the circumstance, but they were strategically rubbish and run by very mediocre people. And one of the great problems that they had is they repeatedly did not understand the constraints and opportunities of distance and other geographical factors.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there, and you've catapulted us into the 20th century. If we might backtrack a couple decades from World War II to World War I, which of course set all kinds of new precedents in the practice of warfare. How did that conflict affect mapping?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, two major stages: the initial maneuver stage, and then front lines that are, whilst not completely fixed, that move less. In the initial maneuver stage, mapping is quite important, but in a sense, they're using the maps they have already. Those maps are not illuminated as maps are to be in World War II at that stage by extensive knowledge gained of your opponent's area. So the Germans, for example, have very weak understanding of the gauges of the French railways, what these mean. The German war plan, as Annika Mombayer showed in her book on the 1914 campaign, the German war plan, in fact, operates in a kind of vacuum. There's no plan B, and there's more seriously no ability to create a plan B when plan A goes wrong. And in a way, there are information limitations there. Now, the situation changes once you have a more coherent front line, what we call the trenches or the Western Front. What you then get is really quite detailed mapping for both tactical and operational reasons. The tactical reason is to enable you to aim accurately your artillery pieces. There's no point landing shells a quarter of a mile behind your opponent's front line. You want to take out trench lines. The operational reason is because you want to understand where your opponent exactly is so that you can break into that, and then crucially, because often they did break in, it's break out from it. In other words, if you like, have a breakthrough and a breakout. The wherewithal of mapping changes completely, absolutely, totally because of aircraft. The majority of aircraft used in World War I were used neither for fighters nor for bombers. They were used for reconnaissance. And indeed, fighters came into their own initially in order to drive off the other side's reconnaissance aircraft. And reconnaissance exists, it's helped by the fact that already prior to the war, American technology here, they've already had the first aerial photography. Wilbur Wright does it over Italy, in fact. So you have the ability to record what you're seeing relatively accurately. They develop quite accurate mechanisms to do this. Photography at an angle, for example, and they then reproduce the maps very quickly, so that whereas I've got the figures in one of my books, whereas the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, goes out to France in 1914 with virtually nobody to map, by 1918 it has the most enormous mapping mechanism. So maps become very important, and the significance of them grows during the war. In a sense, you have in 1917, 1918, what Jonathan Bailey calls the three-dimensional battlefield. In other words, I don't know how much you know about the way in which World War I mean this, the general group, I know you know, Greg, how the way in which World War I studies have gone. I mean, when I was a sort of child, the sort of noddy version was that tanks and aircraft opened up the Western Front, and that's why the war changed. Now, the argument is that in fact, 1918, the breakthrough battles, including the destruction of the main German army. Remember, in 1944 and 1945, the main German army is not on the Western Front, it's on the Eastern Front. The main German army that is destroyed by the Western powers is in fact in World War I. Now, it's now argued that this is much more the 3D battlefield, very effective use of heavy artillery, relying on aerial reconnaissance, pre-registered guns, because as you probably know, every single gun is slightly different. So you need to pre-register your guns. And of course, the storm of steel approach, massive short barrages, followed by attacks of troops who by 1918 are not going in long lines to be machine gunned. Now, this does depend on a really strong knowledge of the ground. And I think it's fair to say that that exists. I mean, I can show you, you can look at my maps of war. The maps that they produce, obviously you've got maps of your own lines, but you're not particularly interested in those unless you have to counterattack your opponents, which is important. What is impressive is the maps on the other side. And I remember I once wrote a book on World War I, and I was looking at the diary of a chap called Percy Worrell, who was a lieutenant colonel, and he's writing about the German offensive, spring offensive on the Lys in 1918. And he's talking about how the Germans have broken through, and his unit is sitting there, and both his flanks are collapsing. And he decides he's not going to retreat. And he refers to, picking up his field telephone, telephoning the battery to his rear, which is instructed to support him, and giving them a map reference and saying, this, giving them the reference and saying rapid. And he said, within a minute, shells started to land on that map reference, which is where his opponents were. Now, that level of sophistication in fighting and requires a really precise understanding. I mean, obviously, all of this information had to be reduced to mathematical forms. You had to deal with all sorts of variable base maps. All of that has to be dealt with. There's an enormous amount of sophisticated mathematical work required here, and it's very effective. By 1918, the Western Allies have a really effective reconnaissance system, which is used to really help their very heavy artillery opening up the front line.
It's amazing the progress that was made. Now, returning to World War II, you mentioned Hitler's geographical ignorance, the Germans' limitations as strategists. Were there, in addition to those flaws in the German war machine, were there other major mapping problems that either side encountered during World War II?
Oh, yes. I mean, enormous problems. I mean, if you're looking at it, let's look at it from our perspective. If you're looking at it from the British and the American perspective, they are particular problems in the Pacific. There are no good, reliable maps, for example, for New Guinea, where the Australians and the Americans campaign. There are no good maps, really good maps. There are some maps, but there are no really good maps for the Solomons. The British mapping for Burma is not good. I mean, General Slim says that he'd spent his entire career campaigning on what he called the edge of the map, or where maps meet. So you've got real problems, and the Japanese have similar problems. I ought to add. So New Guinea is probably the worst, and in New Guinea, Burma, there's the same problem. You have very wooded, deep valleys with very heavy ground mist, if you like, and therefore aerial reconnaissance and aerial mapping is not brilliant. There's a limitation. On top of that, you have the problems with amphibious landings. The Americans had that at Tarawa, of course. with the offshore coral reefs there. You have the problems that only limited amount of information is available pre-war on the on places on the islands. I mean, the Americans comment, for example, on how poor their maps are of Wake. So mapping is an enormous problem in the Pacific War. No two ways about it. Now, where else is mapping a problem? Well, for the Soviet Union, I mean, you know, it's a totalitarian regime, and Stalin had shot a fair amount of his statisticians in the 30s when they'd done inconvenient things like say that a lot of Ukrainians had died in the famine. But the specific problem for the Soviet war mapping is this. The Soviets had been mapping the Soviet Union, specifically, in fact, to help prepare them militarily. But of course, in 1939 and 1940, they had conquered a large amount of territory in eastern Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Bessarabia from Romania. And all of that was very poorly planned, mapped from their point of view. So the Soviet maps are very poor. The German mapping of those areas, and indeed of the Soviet Union, isn't marvelous, which is why for the Germans it's very important in their advance to seize Soviet map stores. So they seize one at Minsk, for example, and they seize one at Kharkov, and those are both very valuable to them. But I think it's fair to say that on the Eastern Front, where the distances are also enormous, the map information for both sides is limited. I think that's what I would say. It is limited. Where maps are best is France. The maps for France are good. And of course, the Allies, the British and the Americans, have the enormous advantage that they knew where they intended to land in 1944. And so therefore, they had produced quite good mapping, both by aerial reconnaissance, but also by very brave men who were infiltrated onto the beaches from landing craft and submarines and at night, and took off information on the nature of beach defenses, the natures of beach gradients. And on top of that, there was a certain amount of information came in from the resistance. So I think it's fair to say that the Allied maps for D-Day are pretty good. I mean, obviously there were flaws, and we know there are flaws, but the flaws are largely a matter of how the Allies responded. So the not using heavy ships to bomb the defense, to shell the defenses at Omaha, instead using aircraft which weren't as good. Releasing the tanks further out to sea than they should have been. Those weren't flaws due to the maps they had. Those were flaws due to how they decided to respond to the information. Again, the largely American Operation Dragoon on the south coast of France on, I think it's August the 15th, 1944. Again, that has very good maps. I reproduced some of those in my book, and it's not just air view maps. They're maps of what you would see from landing craft, what you would see from warships. They're really pretty sophisticated maps. So I think it's fair to say that the British and the Americans start off with big disadvantages in the Pacific, but the skill and sophistication of their mapping helps them to address these. And indeed, if you're looking at American maps by 1945, American map preparation for the invasion of Japan is pretty good. I mean, you know, no two ways about it. It is good.
Our time is flying. Of course, you're covering such broad swaths of history. That's not surprising. But let's top this off before we get to some audience questions. Any thoughts about how modern warfare, however you want to define that, has affected mapping?
Yes, well, that's fascinating. I mean, the digital nature of modern mapping means that you can use it to integrate weapons systems at a scale and pace that is unprecedented. It can obviously not necessarily, though, convey you the information that you might require. In other words, if we move into this space occupied by civilians, are many of them going to shoot us in the back, or are they just going to glumly watch us pass? And so, in other words, what one is often got is a disjuncture between what you might call the mapping of military units, your own and your opponents, and the mapping of the general political environment that's very difficult. So if you were thinking about tasks that might affect the United States. If there was a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then the American information systems, I mean, the Chinese would try and take them down. They'd try and destroy the satellites, but the American information systems have the potential to provide an immediate 3D real-time mapping of where everything is and what is going on. So that's great. But obviously, as we've known from conflicts over the last 20 years, there are many political environments where the situation is much more difficult. So, I think it partly depends upon the war or the conflict that one ends up in.
We've had questions coming in from the audience since you started talking, and I'll try and get to some of those in the time that we have left.
I'll lean over and get a cup of tea whilst you're doing that.
Well, sure, certainly. One of our audience members wanted to know if you can talk about how common was it to publish maps for public consumption, and were these publicly available maps were they useful to contending militaries?
Yes, I mean, in the 18th century, the British published their maps, as in fact they did in the 19th century. Admiralty maps were published. And they could well be useful to your opponents. Yes, I think that is a very fair point.
There's a quintessential American question. I think, again, one of the folks in the audience wants to know if intelligence collected by frontier scouts or exploratory parties, if they impacted on the maps that would be carried by war fighters in subsequent conflicts.
Yes, I mean, but the thing is, it's interesting. I give a lecture on the mapping of the American Revolution, and one of the maps I have is of the Lake Champlain area, and the degree of information on the shores of the lake is excellent, really excellent. And then if you look to most of the map, it's just blank. It's left completely white because all they're really concerned about is moving round or on the lake. And I emphasize on the lake as well, because that, as we know from 1814, is very important. I think partly it depends upon the already known quantity and quality of the environment. So for the Americans operating in the West, in areas that had not been adequately mapped in the 1840s, in 1846, 48 against Mexico, and subsequently against the Native Americans, scouting information is really important then, really important. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of adding additional information, if you're in an area where there has already been a reasonable amount of information available, let's say Eastern Virginia in 1861, 1862, I mean, it's not as though somebody's going to move Fredericksburg, or that that the railway between there and Richmond is going to change direction. So there, in a sense, scouts are very useful for telling you where other units are moving, and even more useful for giving you information, if they can, about which units they are, but they can't really tell you very much about the physical geography because that's not changing. Although they can tell you sometimes about whether rivers are higher or lower than usual. So it partly depends upon how far the environment is already known, or the opposite, just as we were talking about World War II, no real difference there.
Yes. One of our listeners is interested in practice of deception in warfare, and he or she asks if any power used fake maps, distribution of fake maps to try to mislead their opponents.
Oh yes, there's, and in fact, Marc Monmunier, American scholar in How to Lie with Maps, which is a good book, slightly sort of classically, left-wing conspiratorial, but nevertheless quite a good book. I mean, he deals with the sort of thing that is well known, that you would often leave off major military sites from maps, or you would disguise their exact position. Not much point doing that these days necessarily, given the intensity of surveillance, but so for example, the British with the Woolwich Arsenal, or the British with the Atomic Energy Research Institution at Harwell, the Soviets very generally, enormous degree of deception, if you like. So yes, I mean, your questioner is absolutely correct. The downgrading, and I think I'm correct in saying, I think I mentioned this in one of my books, for a long time, the GPS systems that were sold to the public were, by the United States, were to a degree degraded, so that they shouldn't be used for weapons guidance for targeting, that, because as you're probably aware, I mean, you've got to be, the effectiveness of a weapon really does depend on its targeting. If the targeting is driven by coordinates, then those coordinates, if they're even slightly wrong, then the weapon becomes relatively ineffective. So let me give you a classic example. If any listeners were planning, let us say, to invade any particular coastline, and decided that they would cover that invasion by a volley of cruise missiles fired by submarines or surface warships, with these cruise missiles being aimed at 100 meters beyond the coastline, or let's say 1,000 meters, if you like, whichever level you think your opponent's going to have their defenses, you're in real trouble. Real trouble if you're using a standard map, because the standard map is generally accurate only twice a day for the coastline. So if you plan from a information-driven system, digitized, without really thinking about that information, you've generally got a coastline that records the mean between high tide and low tide. Even if it records high tide and low tide, that's not going to be much good to you. So you really need a separate system, as it were, to add. So there can be deliberate deception, or there can be just the general flaws of mapping. And remember, maps aren't necessarily, I mean, I use the phrase fit for purpose. Maps aren't necessarily made for the specific purpose that you want to use them for. And that, again, is a real problem.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. Another listener has slipped the surly bonds of land warfare and asks if you think that either naval warfare or air warfare have had a greater impact on the evolution of mapping.
Well, I think certainly naval warfare was absolutely crucial to understanding the sea. There's no two ways about it. Naval mapping was very limited until you get to conflict and operations beyond the sight of land. And I think it's fair to say that you're not really talking about that till the 16th century. So you get 16th century battles in the Atlantic, you get a French-Spanish battle in the Azores, for example, in the early 1580s, but overwhelmingly battles are in inshore waters, and they're often what I call encounter battles. Now, The naval situation thereafter changes, and it changes for those powers that wish and need to plan long-range deep water operations. Clearly, naval warfare must be less important than land warfare for a simple reason, that there are fewer naval powers than there are army powers. You know, that there are states which are inland states, or there are states which don't have any significant navy. But for those states that do have a significant navy, which is the minority of states, then mapping is very important. Aircraft, similar sort of thing. As you may know, I did a history of air power, and one of the things that my history of air power argues is that alongside our inevitable fascination with the leading power in the pack, the United States, of course, one has to understand that if you look at military history from what is referred to as the paradigm power, you're going to get it wrong, because the most powers are not the paradigm power. Most powers have different doctrine, tasking, force structure, military ideology, etc., command experience. So if you want to talk about air power and its use, you probably ought to be looking at those states that aren't the leading air power states, but that either use it, Syria at the present moment, or have it and don't use it, Brazil, because you get a better idea about what air power is understood by then than if you're looking at the leading power. Same reason not to look at the British Navy in the 19th century. It's fascinating. I mean, I've written a history of you know, which covers it. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't tell you about most navies in the world, because most navies in the world knew they were not going to be the leading naval power, and therefore their understanding of their force tasking in part rested on how to thwart the leading naval power, or how to engage in conflict without the leading naval power. America attacking Spain in 1898, for example.
Well, I can't begin to thank you enough for the time you've shared with us today. It's just been an absolute treat. And for people who have heard you for the first time, I'm sure they'll be looking for additional opportunities in the future to repeat that pleasure. And I refer them to your website, which has links that can lead them to your podcasts, to your blogs, and your other activities. But having expressed my thanks for myself on behalf of the audience, I'm turning the microphone back to Roger now.
Thank you, Greg.
I want to, I hope everyone can hear me now. So that was remarkable. With all due respect to Greg Irwin and all other professors of history, if you read one half of Jeremy Black's books, it's like you're taking your own course in world history and military history. The expanse of his library is just remarkable, and I've provided you with the link. You will have, I will be sure to put the link to his website on the historyauthortalks.com. You'll see under the past shows, as well as the recorded video of this show. I would like to first thank Gregory Irwin for his wonderful questions to our esteemed guest. And to Jeremy Black, I thank you for your time. And just a wonderful, wonderful show. While the show was going on, there was one member of the audience who is one of my clients, Norm Damaris. And during the show, he texted me to say that he just received his author copies of the book that is coming out next month called Washington's Engineer. He's written a biography of Louis Deportes. And he is going to be joining us on Tuesday for our next episode of History Author Talks. And we invite you all to join us on Tuesday. Again, I want to thank Jeremy Black for his time and Greg Irwin. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on History Author Talks. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. But I will be forwarding those questions along to our author. So thank you again and have a wonderful Saturday, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.